Today, before we start, I want to tell you 3 facts about Christopher Columbus. 1. He ordered indigenous people's hands cut off when they failed to meet gold quotas. 2. He sent men, women, and children across the Atlantic as enslaved captives. And 3. He was arrested by the Spanish crown and sent back to Spain in chains. Because people at that time reported his rule as brutal and unmanageable. Oh, and one more thing, none of that is newly discovered. It was documented while he was alive. So the question isn't why our view of Columbus has changed, it's why it took so long. Most of us didn't really learn history as a debate. We learned it as something finished. Certain people were heroes. Certain events were inevitable. The meaning was already decided by the time it reached us. We're not often invited into uncertainty, but more so handed conclusions. And that's not because teachers were lying or because textbooks were malicious. It's because the version of history most of us encounter is designed to feel stable. And stability is comforting. It gives us a sense that the past makes sense, that the outcomes were logical, and that everything led somewhere. But that comfort comes at a cost. Because once a story hardens, once it stops feeling provisional, it also stops asking questions. So, in this episode, I want to slow that process down. I want to look at 3 figures from the late medieval and early modern world, figures most of us recognize instantly, and ask a slightly different kind of question. Because when you start tracing how narratives form, how they shift, and how they eventually calcify, something uncomfortable begins to emerge. History isn't just written by the winners. It's shaped by the needs of the moment. And once you start noticing that pattern in kings and empires and explorers, it becomes very hard to stop seeing it everywhere else. So let's rewind and let's get into it. Before we get into kings and wars and empires, I want to tell you what actually sparked this episode. And it wasn't a book or an archive, it was Reddit. I was scrolling, as one does, and I came across a thread absolutely tearing into Anne Boleyn. Not in a casual way, but in a full moral indictment kind of way. People were arguing that she didn't deserve the fascination or sympathy that she gets, and that there was proof she'd been cruel to Catherine of Aragon, that she was ruthless in her pursuit of the crown, that she was manipulative and ambitious and cold. And none of that on its own surprised me, because people have been debating Anne Boleyn for 500 years. What stopped me was the tone. This was someone in 2025 holding a woman from the early 1500s to modern standards of emotional intelligence, feminism, marital ethics, and personal morality, and then declaring her unworthy because she failed them. And I remember thinking, of course she failed them. She's not living in our world. And that thought, that disconnect, is really the reason this episode exists, because one of the core responsibilities of historians isn't to decide who we'd want to sit next to at a dinner party, although that's a fun icebreaker. It's to reconstruct context, to ask what constraints people were operating under, what incentives shaped their choices, what threats made certain actions feel rational or even necessary at the time. That doesn't mean excusing harm or romanticizing power. It means acknowledging that behavior isn't free-floating. It's shaped by systems, survival, expectation, and fear. And when we strip all of that away, when we flatten the past into modern morality plays, we don't actually get clarity. We get caricatures. That Reddit thread didn't make me angry as much as it just made something click, because Anne Boleyn isn't unique. The same thing happens with kings who went to war, with monarchs who enforced religious unity, with explorers who later become symbols of entire civilizations. We take people who lived inside brutal systems, isolate individual actions, remove the context that made those actions legible or even rewarded, and then act surprised when the story stops making sense. Which is why today, before we ever get to the Tudors, and yes, we will get there in a future episode, I want to take a step back. I want to look at an earlier moment, a moment before the modern world fully takes shape, a moment where history starts to harden into stories that feel inevitable. So now I want to sit with Christopher Columbus for a minute. not the symbol or the holiday version, the actual person as he appears in the record while he's still alive. Because one of the strangest things about Columbus is that his story doesn't harden when you'd expect it to. It doesn't crystallize at the moment of discovery. It doesn't immediately turn into legend, and it definitely doesn't solidify around admiration. If anything, it does the opposite. It frays. Columbus's first voyage in 1492 is undeniably received as a success. He returns to Spain to celebration. He's granted titles and he's given authority, and for a brief moment, he looks like exactly the kind of figure a rising empire might want to hold on to. But that moment doesn't last, because once Columbus is no longer sailing, once he's no longer useful as a navigator and is instead asked to govern, the story starts to wobble. He becomes governor of Hispaniola, and almost immediately problems surface. Not minor disagreements, not isolated complaints, structural failures. Columbus governs through punishment, through spectacle, through fear. Gold quotas are imposed, and when indigenous people fail to meet them, their hands are cut off and hung around their necks as warnings. Whippings, mutilations, and executions are not rare responses. They're part of the system that he built. And this isn't happening in some distant fog where nobody's paying attention. Spanish settlers complain. Clergy complain. Administrators complain. Letters are sent back to the crown describing a governor who can't maintain order without terror, who alienates everyone around him, who governs rigidly and reacts harshly when challenged. This is important to sit with because it changes how the story feels. Columbus isn't misunderstood in his own time. He's understood just fine. By 1500, less than a decade after his celebrated voyage, the Spanish monarchy sends a royal investigator to the Caribbean, not to congratulate him, but to assess him. Columbus is arrested, he's put in chains, and he's shipped back to Spain. And I want to pause here because this is the point where modern retellings tend to flinch. This gets treated as an unfortunate episode in his story, a misunderstanding, or a technicality, something that can be bracketed off so the larger story can continue uninterrupted. But if you actually stay with it, it's hard to do that. This isn't just hindsight. This isn't modern morality applied retroactively. This is contemporaneous judgment. People are living inside the same moral universe as Columbus and deciding that his rule is brutal, unmanageable, and destabilizing. He's ultimately stripped of his governorship. He never fully regains royal favor, and the last years of his life are spent filing petitions, arguing over titles, and demanding compensation, insisting that he's been wronged. And when Columbus dies in 1506, he doesn't die as a hero. He dies frustrated and bitter and largely sidelined, which creates a problem, narratively at least. Because if Columbus isn't revered in his own lifetime, and if his authority collapses this quickly, then when does he become Christopher Columbus? The version most of us recognize doesn't exist yet. What surprised me most when I started pulling on this thread is how long that pause lasts. For centuries after his death, Columbus is remembered, but he isn't elevated. He appears in record, but he's not central. He's not mythologized. He's not carrying symbolic weight. When Spanish imperial narratives take shape, the emphasis falls elsewhere. It falls on conquest, on administration, on figures who actually build and manage empire on the ground. Cortes, Pizarro, viceroys, bureaucrats. Columbus shows up, but more like a footnote to momentum. He's the spark, not the story. The beginning, but not the meaning. And here's where things get really interesting. Most of the damning details about Columbus's governance aren't missing during this period. They're documented and they're known. They're part of the historical record, which tells us something important, not because it needs to be stated outright, but because of what doesn't happen. There's no grand reckoning here. There's no dramatic fall from grace, no urgent need to resolve his legacy one way or the other. Columbus simply recedes. And that's a clue, because if later generations are shocked by Columbus, it isn't because the information wasn't there. It's because the emphasis changed. What happens later isn't a revelation. It's a selection. And that selection doesn't happen immediately. It takes centuries. And when it does happen, it has very little to do with Columbus himself. By late 18th and 19th centuries, Emerging nation states are facing a different problem entirely. They need origin stories, not messy ones, not morally complicated ones, stories that feel usable, stories that don't tie them too tightly to European monarchy, inherited guilt, or the administrative grind of empire. They need a beginning that feels clean. And once you start looking for a figure who can serve that function, Columbus suddenly makes sense. He's distant enough to feel abstract, European but not British, early enough to stand in for the, quote, beginning, but removed enough from later conquest that the violence can be blurred. And this is where the story starts to shift. Columbus doesn't get reintroduced as a failed governor or a brutal administrator or a man whose authority collapsed within a decade. He's reframed as something much simpler. He's the man who began everything. This is where writers like Washington Irving enter the picture. And this is where the psychology really starts doing the work. Irving doesn't just polish Columbus, he fundamentally changes how we're meant to relate to him. Columbus becomes a lone visionary and a misunderstood genius, a man bravely insisting the world is round when everyone else scoffs. Historically, though, that's nonsense. Educated Europeans already know the Earth was spherical. That debate isn't happening the way the story suggests. But accuracy isn't the point here. It's function. Because this version of Columbus does something very specific. If Columbus was smarter than everyone around him, if he alone could see what others couldn't, then recognizing his brilliance now doesn't just say something about him, it says something about us. It flatters the present. And it turns Columbus into a mirror instead of a problem. And once that alignment clicks, the story starts to move. It gets repeated because it feels good to repeat. Complexity gets smoothed out because smooth stories travel faster. Textbooks simplify, monuments go up, and holidays get formalized. Over time, Columbus stops being a man with a contradictory record and becomes something much cleaner. He's a symbolic starting line. But Columbus's story doesn't stop evolving there. By late 19th and early 20th centuries, Italian immigrants in the United States are facing intense discrimination. They're described as foreign and dangerous, and in some cases, they're openly treated as suspect simply for existing. And if you're living inside that kind of hostility, history stops being abstract. You start looking for proof that you belong. This is where Columbus gets picked up again, not because anything about Columbus has changed, but because what he can do symbolically suddenly matters. Italian immigrant communities begin to claim him more explicitly. He's framed as Italian, even though Italy wasn't technically a country when he was born, but he's framed that way because he was born in Genoa. He's framed as a Catholic, as foundational to the American story itself. Newspapers celebrate him and parades are organized, and Columbus Day becomes a thing. And if you step back, the logic is clear here. Celebrating Columbus becomes a way of saying, we didn't just arrive, we were here at the beginning. We're not an intrusion, we're part of the origin. Once Columbus starts doing that kind of emotional work, criticism stops landing cleanly. Because now it isn't just about a 15th century navigator, it's about belonging. So when people push back on Columbus, it doesn't feel like historical revision. It feels like erasure to them, like someone is pulling away one of the few symbols that ever said that you count. At that point, defending Columbus isn't really about Columbus anymore. It's about defending what he's been asked to carry for them. This is where the modern debate often gets stuck, so I want to slow this part down. It's easy to assume that controversy around Columbus exists because new information surfaced late in the 20th century. But when you actually look at the record, that doesn't hold. Columbus's use of forced labor was documented early, and so was the violence. So was the scale of indigenous population collapse under Spanish rule. When sources talked about forced labor, they weren't talking abstractly. Columbus authorized the capture and shipment of indigenous people to Spain as enslaved captives. Men, women, and children, some of whom died en route. The facts were always there. What changed was what the story needed to do. By the late 20th century, the conditions that protected Columbus's myth began to shift again. Indigenous voices gain wider platforms. Colonialism is reassessed more directly. National origin stories lose some of their insulation. And once that happens, the symbolic weight Columbus has been carrying starts to crack. Because when a figure has been flattened into, quote, the beginning, all the consequences of that beginning eventually come back to him. Columbus stops representing exploration and starts representing conquest, enslavement, dispossession, and that reaction makes sense. And in many ways, it's earned. Columbus was brutal. He did preside over violence, mutilation, enslavement, and catastrophic loss of life. None of that needs to be softened, and none of it needs to be rebalanced for comfort. What's worth noticing, though, isn't that people are angry now. It's why all of that anger is landing on him. Because Columbus didn't just become a historical figure, he became a stand-in, a symbolic starting point, a container for everything that followed. And once someone is asked to carry that much meaning between origin and innocence and legitimacy, the backlash when it finally comes is going to be explosive. Columbus isn't difficult because the evidence is unclear. He's difficult because his story shows us something uncomfortable. History didn't misunderstand him. It used him. And once you see that, Columbus stops being just a man who did terrible things and starts becoming something else entirely. An example of how narratives get engineered to solve emotional and political problems and how long they can survive, even when the record is sitting there the whole time. And that's why Columbus belongs here. Because while he's sailing west, Ferdinand and Isabella are doing something just as consequential back home. They're not waiting for history to reinterpret them. They're writing the story themselves in real time. So I know we just talked about Columbus in 1492, but I want to go back to 1492 because this is one of those years that almost feels scripted. It's neat and it's memorable, and it's the kind of date people recognize instantly, even if they're hazy on the details, which should already make us a little suspicious, because history rarely lines itself up this cleanly unless we're doing some work for it after the fact. From the Spanish crown's perspective, though, 1492 really does solve a lot of problems all at once. Granada falls, ending centuries of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. Jews are expelled from Spain, and Columbus sails west under royal sponsorship. 3 enormous decisions are made here. 3 very different populations are affected, and over time, those events start to blur together into something that feels intentional, almost elegant. Spain becomes unified, faith becomes clarified, and empire is very much underway. But what gets lost in that tidy story is how much pressure was sitting underneath it. Because Spain in the late 1400s isn't a nation in the modern sense. It's a collection of kingdoms, laws, languages, and faiths that have been stitched together through marriages, truces, and uneasy compromises. Christians, Muslims, and Jews have lived alongside one another for centuries, not fully peacefully in some idealized way, but functionally. Trade happens and scholarship happens, and daily life is definitely happening here. That matters because it means Ferdinand and Isabella don't necessarily inherit chaos. They inherit complexity. And complexity is a nightmare if you're trying to build a centralized state. When their marriage brings Castile and Aragon together, something genuinely new becomes possible. A single Christian monarchy, a crown that can speak with one voice, a state that doesn't have to negotiate internally every time it wants to act. That possibility becomes intoxicating. But it comes with a problem that shows up in every early nation-building project. Unity sounds great in theory. In practice, though, it requires boundaries. And boundaries force you to decide who belongs and who doesn't. The fall of Granada is usually told as the triumphant end of the Reconquista, the moment when Christian Spain finally reclaims the peninsula from Islamic rule. And there's truth in that. But it's also one campaign among many, landing at a moment when Ferdinand and Isabella are actively consolidating authority. Granada's fall doesn't just remove Muslim rule, it sends a signal. This is who Spain is now. And signals matter when you're trying to convince people that a new political order is permanent. That same year, Ferdinand and Isabella issue the Edict of Expulsion. And when you read the decree itself, what's striking isn't just what it does, it's how carefully it explains itself. The crown doesn't say Jews are being expelled because they are Jews. Instead, it claims that Christians are being harmed by proximity, that Judaizing influences are spreading. That interaction itself is the danger. Reading it, what kept jumping out at me was how modern the framing feels. The problem isn't violence, it's contamination. And once something is framed that way, the crown doesn't have to defend cruelty, it just has to defend prevention. They aren't causing harm, they're stopping it. That rhetorical move is incredibly powerful because once you accept the premise, everything that follows can be justified as responsibility rather than aggression. The part that really locks this into place for me becomes 9 months later. By December of 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella aren't talking about belief anymore. They're talking about property, about seized goods and debts owed. There's a line instructing officials not to confiscate Jewish property too openly in their hometowns because it could cause unrest, but to make sure it all gets taken anyway. And that tonal shift is important because the moral explanation has already done its job. The story has been told and the justification is settled at this point. Now the state can just move into logistics. And this is where narrative construction stops being abstract, because what we're watching is the handoff between ideology and administration. The lofty language happens first, the consequences are handled quietly through paperwork. A few years later, a Jewish chronicler describes what actually happened. People were selling their houses and vineyards for almost nothing, just to escape in time, being forbidden from leaving with gold or silver, even after liquidating everything they own. This is where policy language collapses into reality. What sounds like expulsion on paper becomes a countdown in real life. Assets end up losing value overnight. Everything you own turns into something you have to move fast enough or it disappears. When I read that, what stuck with me wasn't the decree itself, it was the speed. How quickly a functioning life turns into a scramble. And then there's the atmosphere surrounding all of this. A contemporary cleric writes that Jews might be purified with fire and a faggot. That's not metaphor, that's someone casually talking about burning people alive as moral cleansing. And I think that matters because it tells us where the language of purity is actually living. It's not confined to the royal decree. It's shaping how ordinary people imagine what's acceptable, even righteous. Once purification becomes the goal, violence doesn't feel like excess. It feels like completion. Centuries later, historians like William Prescott describe the expulsion as the persecution of an innocent, industrious people. And that's true, it is persecution. It is tragic, but notice what happens in that framing. The suffering becomes something that just occurred. The rulers remain founders, and the nation remains inevitable. Nothing is denied, it's just rearranged. The structure that produced the harm fades into the background, while the outcome, a unified Spain, stays front and center. When you line all of this up, with the decree and the follow-up and the lived experience, the later retelling, what becomes clear isn't that anyone hid the evidence. It's that the meaning gets fixed very early. There was justification first, administration second, and then memory last. And once Ferdinand and Isabella are remembered as the people who made Spain possible, questioning their methods starts to feel destabilizing. Because at that point, you're not just revisiting the past. You're pressing on the foundation of how a nation learned to understand itself. After Isabella dies in 1504 and Ferdinand in 1516, their reputations don't soften. They sharpen. They become the founders, the stabilizers, the monarchs who brought order where there was once fragmentation. And that framing does real political work. Later rulers inherit legitimacy. The church inherits moral authority. Even centuries later, authoritarian regimes like Franco's explicitly invoke Ferdinand and Isabella as symbols of the true Spain, meaning Catholic and unified and obedient. And here's the part that I think often gets overlooked. The beneficiaries aren't just monarchs or institutions, it's also the public. Because clean origin stories reduce anxiety. They tell people that chaos had a purpose, that suffering led somewhere, that the power governing them is legitimate. And psychologically, that can become comforting, especially when the alternative is sitting with the idea that a nation's foundations are contingent or violent or unresolved. Only much later do historians start asking a different question, not whether Ferdinand and Isabella succeeded, they clearly did, but what success required. Because over time, the obsession with religious purity starts to hollow Spain out. Expelled Jewish communities take skills, capital, and networks with them. Intellectual life narrows. Surveillance breeds fear rather than loyalty. The Inquisition isn't a footnote, it becomes a defining institutional legacy. Unity achieved through exclusion turns out to be brittle. But that's not an insight a rising empire is eager to hear. When power is consolidating and wealth is flowing in, people don't necessarily want analysis, they want affirmation. And as long as the story provides that, it keeps doing its work. So, at this point, we've been sitting with rulers who are actively shaping how they want to be remembered, defining unity and drawing boundaries, writing meaning into policy. And what struck me as I was working through all of this is how different the next story feels, because Henry V doesn't spend his reign telling people what his rule means. He lets one moment do it for him. A single victory becomes the thing everything else orbits around: the justification, the memory, the measuring stick. And once that happens, the story doesn't need much help. It carries itself. When Henry V shows up in our cultural memory, he almost always arrives fully formed. He's already confident, already righteous, already standing in a muddy field telling a group of exhausted men that they're lucky to be there. That version of Henry is so familiar it's easy to forget something important. He didn't start that way. And Agincourt didn't begin as a morality play, it began as a gamble. By the time Henry becomes king in 1413, England's position is shaky at best. His father took the crown by force, and rebellions followed. Loyalty is uneven, and the monarchy still feels provisional. So when Henry pushes England back into war with France, it isn't just foreign policy, it's personal. War offers him something governance alone can't: proof. If he can succeed where others stalled, he doesn't just gain territory, he gains authority. He rewrites the story of how he came to power, and that's the part that matters psychologically. Leaders don't go to war only when they're confident. They go to war when waiting feels more dangerous. Henry invades France in 1415, and almost immediately the campaign starts to unravel. Disease spreads, and supplies run low. He's deep in enemy territory, and retreat would be humiliating. Agincourt isn't a carefully staged showdown, though. It's a confrontation Henry doesn't fully control, and yet, against overwhelming odds, the English win. Historians can explain how, between the terrain and the weather and the longbows and the French overconfidence, but what matters more is what the victory meant to the people watching it unfold. Because medieval Europe doesn't separate military outcomes from moral ones. Victory isn't just success, it's judgment. Henry leans into that immediately. After Agincourt, he credits God, not tactics. He orders that praise go upward, not outward. Chroniclers emphasize his fasting and prayers and discipline at this time. French defeat gets framed as arrogance. English survival is framed as humility. And you can feel the story taking shape in real time. Order is rewarded and pride is punished. Agincourt isn't just a win, it's validation. And once a victory starts to feel divinely sanctioned, questioning the man behind it stops sounding like analysis, and it starts to sound like doubt. There's one problem with that story, though. During the battle, Henry orders the execution of French prisoners. Even by medieval standards, that's unsettling. Prisoners are valuable. Nobles are ransomed, and killing them isn't just violent, it's often financially irresponsible and unusual. Contemporaries notice this, but when Agincourt gets remembered, this moment never becomes central. It's mentioned briefly and explained away, and treated as necessity rather than choice. English accounts move past it quickly. French and Burgundian sources don't. If Agincourt is the moment people remember, Rouen is the moment that the legend depends on people forgetting. Rouen isn't a battle, it's a siege. Months of waiting. There's pressure, attrition, and Henry is very good at sieges. By 1418, the city is starving. Supplies are gone. Food disappears slowly and then all at once. And eventually, the people inside the walls make a desperate choice. They push the poor out. There's women and children and elderly and anyone who can't fight and can't be fed. They're sent out with the hope that Henry will let them pass through his lines. He doesn't. Henry allows them to leave Rouen and then refuses to let them go anywhere, so they end up becoming trapped. Not inside the city and not free, but stuck between the walls and Henry's army with no food or shelter or way back. Contemporary accounts describe them as starving in the ditches and dying slowly. And the scary part is, this is a strategy, and it works. Rouen falls. Just like Agincourt, the victory gets absorbed into the larger story. The suffering doesn't disappear, it just doesn't become the point. Because Henry's violence keeps producing results. Within 2 years, Henry reaches the height of his power. The Treaty of Troyes names him heir to the French throne. He marries Catherine of Valois. On paper, he's accomplished what English kings had chased for generations. And then he dies. Henry is 35 years old. He never governs a unified kingdom. He never has to reconcile rival systems or manage the resentment that follows conquest. He never has to watch momentum slow or fear that it stops working. He dies at the height of plausibility. What he leaves behind isn't stability, it's a feeling. England has seen what decisive kingship looks like and what victory feels like, what it's like when war, authority, and righteousness appear to line up, and what comes next can't compete. Henry's heir is an infant. France slips away and authority fractures, and within decades, England is fighting itself. And in that contrast, Henry V stops being a king and becomes a standard. As the present deteriorates, the past starts to glow. His reign gets compressed into moral shorthand. People start thinking this is what it looked like when things worked. The violence starts to feel necessary and the ambition starts to feel noble. The suffering gets contextualized by the outcome and it's not erased, just absorbed. By the time Shakespeare writes Henry V, most of the work has already been done. The play doesn't invent the legend, it refines it. Shakespeare's Henry worries, he prays, he wrestles with responsibility, and that matters because it makes the violence feel considered rather than careless. The play doesn't deny brutality, it insists it has meaning. And that distinction is powerful. For centuries, Henry V becomes one of England's safest heroes. He shows up in textbooks and speeches and moments when the country wants to believe that war can be righteous if the leader is disciplined enough. You see this most clearly during World War II when Laurence Olivier's film adaptation turns Henry into a morale symbol. Unity under pressure, courage under fire, and a past that reassures the present. At this point, Henry isn't just history, he's proof that violence can be moral and that authority can sanctify war. Only much later do historians start asking a different question. Not how Henry won, but what he left behind. Because his success turns out to be pretty fragile. It requires constant war, constant pressure, and constant momentum. The moment he's gone, it collapses. So what Henry leaves isn't a system that can survive him. It's actually an impossible inheritance. And that doesn't make his story false, but it makes it a little incomplete. When I started pulling these stories apart, I thought I was mostly interested in the events themselves, the battles, the policies, the decisions, but what I kept coming back to was something quieter. How quickly meaning gets assigned, how early stories start doing work. With Henry and Ferdinand and Isabella and Columbus, the reshaping doesn't wait for centuries of distance. It starts while people are still alive, while consequences are still unfolding, and while there's still something at stake in how events are understood. That surprised me a little, because it made history feel less like a finished record and more like a series of negotiations over legitimacy or responsibility or who gets to define what something meant. Once I started paying attention to that, to the tone and the emphasis, to what gets framed as necessary or inevitable, the past stopped feeling settled. Studying history this way changed what I listened for. I'm less interested now in whether a figure was a hero or a villain or good or bad, and more interested in what their story needed to accomplish at the moment it solidified, who it reassured, what it justified, what made it easier to live with. That's what I find compelling about this period in particular. Not just that so many foundational stories emerge here, but that you can still see the seams. You can still hear the choices being made about what to foreground and what to smooth over. And once you notice that process at work in the past, it becomes very hard not to recognize it elsewhere. Thanks for listening to this again. If this episode made you listen to a familiar story a little differently or made you notice how stories themselves are shaped, I'm glad. While I have you, send this to a friend who just slightly changes the story every time they retell it. I'll see you next time.